Coming out of D23, we finally got some video footage for the upcoming Snow White live action remake. Disney released the first trailer for it, or the teaser trailer for it. And I got to tell you, it's not looking like it's going to be very good, but I'll get more on that first. Let's talk about it from this article in the Hollywood Reporter. Disney's Snow White trailer puts Rachel Zegler, Gadot in a classic tale. The film comes almost 90 years after Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. After years of whistling while she worked, making a new movie, Snow White is finally nearing her return to the big screen. Disney unveiled the first trailer for Snow White at D23 Friday ahead of its March 21, 2025 release date. The film was set to open in March of this year, but Disney pushed it back a year in light of the SAG-AFTRA strike, underscoring its long journey to the screen. Star Rachel Zegler, Snow White, and the evil queen, Gal Gadot, were at D23 2 years ago, showing off the first footage from the movie. And it was at this D23 where a lot of the problems started coming to the surface about this movie, because that's when Rachel Zegler made those comments saying that she thought the prince was a stalker in the original movie, and that she did not like the original one, and they wanted to do a reinterpretation of it where she was more her own woman, and it was kind of like the feminist take of it. And these comments were made back in 2022, but last year they started resurfacing, and then there was a lot of heat surrounding Rachel Zegler as a result of her making these comments, and then her responses to them really weren't helping a whole lot. So people didn't like what they were doing with this movie. So I think what Disney is trying to do, a reason why they actually had such a long delay of this, is because they were actually going back and trying to reshoot a significant portion in order to try to make it more akin to the original movie. They're saying the SAG-AFTRA strikes are the reason why they had such a long delay where they had to push back the release about a year. But you got to keep in mind, the principal photography for this movie was done a year before the strikes even took place. So it doesn't make sense that in a year time frame, they had so many pickup shots where they couldn't conclude them during that time frame, and then the SAG-AFTRA strikes got in the way. I think what most likely happened is that Disney saw during the strikes that a lot of people weren't happy with the direction they were taking the Snow White movie. They spent so much money on it. So they thought, well, we can either take this as a bomb, or we can maybe spend more money on this and try to fix it. And I think that's the approach they got. That's why we have this article too that came out late last year, where it's saying that the movie needs to gross $340 million. And I think this headline's a little bit deceptive, because it makes it seem like once it makes $340 million at the global box office and it's profitable. And that's not really the case. This is just how much they're spending on this movie according to tax filings. And this isn't even taking into consideration how much they're spending on the movie when it comes to marketing and distribution. So that's probably another $100 million tacked onto this. So let's say they're invested $450 million into this movie, since theaters take a cut of the box office. And that means this is a movie that probably needs to gross around, I would say like not 800, like $900 million, most likely closer to the $1 billion mark at a minimum in order for it to be profitable, which I just can't see happening with this movie, especially since they did release the first teaser for it. And you can see on the official Walt Disney Studios YouTube page, it's not really well received. You have 36,000 likes to 78,000 dislikes. So it seems like a lot of people aren't happy with this movie, especially people who I think went into this wanting to like the movie aren't happy with the style of it. Because if you look at it on the surface, it doesn't look too bad. But one of my biggest complaints about it is that it looks kind of cheap, which seems kind of counterintuitive considering how much they actually spent on it. But you look at a lot of the animals, they're clearly CGI, and I'm not really begrudging them for that, because clearly you can't have real animals doing what they're doing. Even well-trained ones can't do what they need them to do. But they're going for, I'm not saying a cheap look, but they're definitely going for a stylized look when it comes to these animals, where they want them to look more fantasy-esque, whimsical, and other things like that, kind of like the Disney style, but then they're going to have human actors interacting with them. And this is another thing that I find ridiculous, just the dwarfs, how cheap that they look too, because they're trying to go stylized with them. And I think it would have been better if they gone human dwarf route as opposed to actually just doing CGI creatures like this, because what's the point? I mean, I know there was that one dwarf actor who was upset that they weren't actually casting dwarf actors, because he's saying there's not really a whole lot of work that they can get. So when you have something like this where there's a big opportunity for them, well, then suddenly it's like, oh, we're not going down that route. We're just going to make CGI characters instead. And then he was upset about that. And a lot of this was a result of Peter Dinklage trying to pull the ladder up from behind him, because he's gotten a pretty good career for himself, so he doesn't want any other dwarf actors basically to muscle in on his territory. So he's trying to make it so others don't get an opportunity to get work. And that's why he complained. Disney's like, okay, fine, we won't cast any real people, and now real dwarf actors upset about it, and the final result looks kind of cheap like this. And this is something that I think is completely avoidable but maybe if I'm going to be charitable and they're trying to go for a stylized approach to this movie, like, I don't know, if they're just doing something like what we saw with Who Framed Roger Rabbit back in the day, where they're going to have human actors interacting with animated characters. And I think that's fine if you're going to go down that route, but you have to lean more into it and make it more stylized, because with the characters like this, I think they're trying to almost find a middle ground where they're trying to make them look realistic, but then also stylized. And when you do that, it just doesn't look good in either direction. And if you would have just gone more heavily in one direction or the other, personally, I think if you're going to do a live action version, then you should try to make it as live action as possible. I would say even use a lot of trained animals if you can, in certain situations where you can't use a real animal, then you use a CGI one. But still, I think that would have been the better route to go. But instead, they're kind of going to this weird middle ground. And I think even people who wanted to go into this liking it aren't happy with the final results, which is probably why this movie has such a bad like to dislike ratio on it. Because even hardcore fans of Disney, like those pixie dusters out there, they can't even get behind this because it just looks like a cheap movie despite how much they actually spent on this. And I think Disney tried to do their best in order to salvage this. They delayed it a year, hoping that the heat will die off around Rachel Zegler, and maybe go through and do a significant reshoots in order to try to fix it. But I don't think it's going to be enough ultimately. And if this movie does need to gross $1 billion, I think it's going to be a tough time for them to actually get that. I think what's probably going to happen is it's going to be like what we saw with The Little Mermaid, where it started off kind of strong. It had a decent opening weekend, and then it just dropped off because then you get all those pixie dusters out there watching it opening weekend because they actually want to see it. But it's not enough to actually bring back new audiences unless the word of mouth is just overwhelmingly good, which I don't really expect that to be the case when it comes to this movie. So I'm thinking this is probably going to be another box office bomb for Disney. But let me know what you think about all this in the comment section below. Do you think there's a way you can actually salvage this movie, or do you think there was just too far gone at this point? If you haven't already, make sure you click that subscribe button if you want to stay up to date with the latest entertainment news. And don't forget to click that like button and share the video out there because it really helps out with the channel. Thank you.